Hi there. Thanks so much, Tom. And I'd like to thank everybody out there who's logging in and taking time out of your busy days, especially with the holidays approaching, to listen in to my talk about red wine and histamine. I think this is a topic that is relevant to so many people today. I myself have encountered a lot of people over the last year or so that have commented to me about issues with their ability to tolerate red wine. And I think with the holidays approaching, most likely we're going to be indulging in a little holiday cheer. That might include red wine, maybe a little bubbly. And for some of us, that wine consumption can lead to more than just a hangover or a queasy stomach the next day. So I'm talking about allergies and intolerances. And that can lead to symptoms such as headache and flushing and racing heart. So that's no way to spend the holidays. And I have some advice that I'm going to be sharing in my webinar. If you found that red wine or other types of alcoholic beverages have not been agreeing with you, I may have some information that can shed some light on that topic and hopefully allow you to better enjoy the holidays and times when you want to have some wine but not suffer with that red wine headache. So I'm just going to, one sec here, advance my slide. Okay, so this gives you an idea of where we're going to be going in this webinar. I'm going to be talking about wine allergy. Is it real? Is it common? Who suffers with these headaches? And this whole issue of red wine headache, which actually has an acronym, RWH. We'll talk about what the underlying contributing factor is to these headaches. Is it the sulfites? Is it histamine? Or is it other factors? We'll take a deeper look at histamine and understand the good and the bad and the ugly when it comes to this compound that is naturally present in our bodies. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about DAO deficiency, and that's diamine oxidase deficiency, a very common problem which affects a lot of people and often goes undiagnosed or undetected for a long period of time. And then we'll talk about food, drugs, and histamine and how some of our favorite beverages and foods could be affecting our ability to process histamine, and even some medications that we might be taking that could be affecting things as well. And then we'll talk about some lifestyle measures for success. So, are you one of those people that is allergic to red wine, or have you heard friends or family or coworkers say, I'm allergic to wine? Is that really a condition? Well, research suggests that about 7% of the population either have an intolerance or they have a reaction to wine. And there was an interesting study that was conducted, and this is actually undertaken in the wine growing area of Germany, where researchers were looking to determine the prevalence of wine intolerance, because in the past it was thought to be quite low, like less than 1% of people to be having issues with consuming wine. So what they did is they surveyed 4,000 people. And again, this was a wine growing area of Germany, so probably a lot of wine drinkers there. And they asked them to complete a questionnaire about their alcohol intake and their occurrence of reactions and allergic type symptoms after drinking wine. So some of the questions that they asked, do you have these particular symptoms after you drink wine? And then how frequent are these symptoms? And they asked them also to comment as to whether they were drinking white, red, or rosé wine. So they had to comment as in terms of whether their reactions were seldom or frequent or always. People were also asked to comment on whether they had other types of intolerances to common allergens such as house dust and pollen and latex. They were also asked about allergies to other foods, common allergens like seafood and nuts and milk, even kiwi and strawberries, which are becoming more recognized in terms of having allergic potential. And they were asked about whether these intolerances had been medically diagnosed. Now, because this study relied on self-reporting and it's not a formal medical diagnosis, all symptoms except for headache were considered as a symptom of possible intolerance. And the reason they excluded headache is because headache can have many diverse causes. There's so many variables that affect headaches, from stress to lack of sleep, hormone imbalance, and so forth. So when they looked at just who was having reactions, 7% of people that responded in this 4,000 person survey responded as having uncomfortable reactions to red wine. And the most common symptoms included flushed skin. So not a hot flash, but your face is getting red, you're getting warm, your skin is turning red. 57% responded that they had experienced flushed skin. Also itching, runny nose, very common as well as diarrhea, racing heart, and stomach and intestinal cramps. So we know that wine in particular contains a lot of different compounds, some great compounds which are, have antioxidant benefits for our heart, maybe have some positive effects in warding off infections and other things. But there's some other components in wine that can be problematic, especially for people that may have an intolerance. And some of those compounds are the proteins. There's the bacteria in the yeast. We know that one of the proteins found in wine, lipid transfer protein, it's a recognized allergen. However, this type of reaction is actually quite rare. But red wine intolerance in particular is quite a common problem. Red wine much more so than white, and that's why we're talking about this red wine headache. It actually has its own acronym because it is recognized to be a common trigger for migraine headaches, but also other symptomology that go along with alcohol or wine intolerances. So the International Headache Society actually defines an immediate alcohol-induced headache as beginning within 3 hours of ingestion and resolving within 72 hours. And as I mentioned, red wine is recognized as a migraine trigger. So what is the culprit? Is it the sulfites? Well, we think that's part of the equation, but it's not thought to be the primary cause in red wine headache. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So what's the difference between red wine and white wine? A lot of people will say, no, I don't understand. Why is it that red wine causes me so many problems compared to white wine? Well, we know that red wine is fermented with the grape skins, whereas white wine is just the juice and the pulp. The skins are not involved in the fermentation process. Grapes do have histamine in them, and that's a recognized compound that causes reactions for people. And even more histamine is created during the fermentation process. Now, we know that a lot of the wine specialists are called enologists. They feel that a process which is called malolactic fermentation, that can create a lot of histamine. And winemakers do vary in their use of this particular type of fermentation, this malolactic fermentation, but in general, very few white wines undergo this process, whereas it's very common in red wines. So there's the issue of histamines, there's the issue of sulfites. And so these may be some of the contributing factors to these headaches that can be so unpleasant for people when they consume wine. So sulfites. Sulfites are a range of compounds. They're sulfur compounds. They can occur naturally, and they can also be added as preservatives to different foods and beverages. And it's quite common to hear people say, I can't tolerate wine because it's the sulfites. And I think sulfites often get blamed without knowing for sure if they are the underlying culprit. Because as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, there are a lot of other compounds, in particular histamine, that can be problematic. But if you look back at this whole awareness of sulfite intolerance or sulfite allergy, what happened back a couple of decades ago in the early 1980s, the FDA determined that I believe it was around 1% of the population was allergic to sulfites. And because of the health implications for those that have allergy or intolerances to sulfites, any wine that has more than 20 parts per million of sulfites must be labeled saying that it has sulfites in the product. And that's why I think a lot of people will attribute their headaches to the sulfites. But as I mentioned, sulfites are also found naturally in a lot of foods. They're in the grapes, and they're added to different foods as preservatives. So you might be surprised to learn that actually red wine has less sulfites in it than white wine, which is kind of counterintuitive. People assume that it's the red wine that would have higher amounts of sulfites, but in fact it is the white wine that has more sulfites. As well, dried fruits, in particular apricots and mangoes, they have anywhere from 5 to 10 times as much sulfites as you will find in wine. Processed meats like lunch meat and hot dogs, they also have plenty of sulfites. So while there may be a basis to having a sulfite allergy or intolerance, it's possible, but it's rare. And experts suggest that the sulfites, it's not the sulfites within themselves that are triggering the problem, but it could be that the sulfites are triggering the release of histamine from mast cells, and that this is actually the main contributor to these reactions we have when we're consuming wine. So let's back it up and take a look at food reactions, because sometimes we'll say, I have an intolerance or I have an allergy. We use those terms synonymously, but there is a difference in terms of what is happening in the body. Adverse reactions to foods can be basically divided into two kinds. You have the toxic reactions, which are food poisoning. So that's when you're traveling abroad, or unfortunately it does happen in our own neighborhoods as well, where you buy some meat or consume something that has been contaminated. Typically it's E. coli, which is a pathogenic bacteria that can cause the horrible gastrointestinal complaints, the diarrhea, the vomiting, the upset stomach. That usually happens quite rapidly within about 12 hours or so. If you've consumed something that's contaminated, it's going to come back to haunt you really quickly. And then we have non-toxic reactions to food as well. And that can be broken down into the immune-mediated and the non-immune-mediated. Excuse me. So when we're looking at immune-mediated, these are your food allergies, and they involve an immune system reaction. And basically what's happening in the body is the immune system is overreacting. It's going haywire. It's reacting inappropriately to an otherwise harmless substance. And some of the most common food allergies we hear of today are allergies to dairy, to wheat, eggs, shellfish, nuts. And typically it's the protein component of these foods. And the reactions that these allergies take on, they can range from mild to severe, and they can also be very life-threatening and very dangerous. And that's why people that have potentially life-threatening allergies will carry an EpiPen, a pen that has epinephrine, to counter an unexpected run-in with that particular food. So those are your food allergies. And then we have the food intolerances. And food intolerances typically originate in the gut, where you have a situation where your body is not able to break down a component of a food. And some of the most common food intolerances are gluten, lactose, and histamine. Now, many of us have heard of gluten and lactose. I myself have a gluten intolerance, celiac disease. And when I was diagnosed back in the mid-1980s, nobody had really heard of it. It was very uncommon. It was thought to affect 1 in 5,000 people. And now we know that actually gluten intolerant celiac disease is quite common, and it affects about 1% of the population. Lactose intolerance is also quite common. People that have lactose intolerance, they don't have enough of an enzyme called lactase to be able to break down the milk sugar, which is lactose, and that can cause more gastrointestinal symptoms, upset stomach, bloating, gas, and diarrhea. So these are commonly known, but I would say out of the 3 food intolerances, the one that is less well known is histamine intolerance. Now, histamine intolerance, it's not new per se. It's been recognized for decades, but it's difficult to diagnose and test for. And until quite recently, there really wasn't a treatment available for people that had a histamine intolerance other than avoiding high histamine foods. But thankfully now today there is a solution, a supplemental strategy that can help people that have histamine intolerance. So let's take a closer look at histamine. Histamine is a natural compound. It's something that is made by the body. And we can also get histamine in our systems from food we eat and also from beverages that we drink. So histamine, which is sometimes vilified, it actually is important, and we need histamine in our body. I think people can relate to histamine in terms of the antihistamine medications. Those are the allergy medications that you buy in the pharmacy if you have sneezing and congestion and runny nose. If you have allergy symptoms triggered by pollen, you might go to the pharmacy and get an antihistamine to block those symptoms. And histamine, though it's not just involved in our immune system, well, it does have an important job in the immune system. It's produced by our mast cells, and it helps to protect us and alert our body against foreign invaders. But histamine is also involved in digestion. It's a very important role in stimulating the release of acid into the stomach. And it's also involved in brain health and helping with the neurotransmitter function as a communicator or a messenger in our brain. So normally, our levels of histamine are kept in check by certain enzymes, in particular, the enzyme called diamine oxidase, or DAO. And it's the job of DAO to break down histamine circulating around the body and in our digestive system. However, if there's an imbalance between histamine and DAO, then a person can suffer the symptoms of histamine intolerance. And I'll show you that in the next slide. So what the graph I'm showing you here illustrates is the different factors that can affect our balance between histamine and DAO. So if you have a genetic deficiency, your body just does not have enough DAO, then you don't have enough of the enzyme to break down histamine, and that can lead to histamine intolerance. You can also have an increased supply of histamine, and that can occur if you're eating a lot of high histamine foods. And I'll show you that shortly, what foods are really high in histamine. So if you have a lot of histamine coming into the body and maybe reduced DAO activity as well, that can bring on this problem of histamine intolerance. And there are also going to be external inhibitors, foods and beverages, and even medications that can reduce DAO activity. So these are some of the contributing factors to histamine intolerance. So what are the symptoms of histamine intolerance? Well, here you go. Flushing, hives, headache, migraines, difficulty falling asleep. Some people will find that they can't rest at night because their heart is racing. There could be dizziness, feeling of imbalance, vertigo. There could be high blood pressure, hypertension. I mentioned accelerated heart rate or racing heart, arrhythmia. You could have a challenge in regulating your body temperature. You could have feelings of anxiety. There can be nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps. And then also the typical histamine-like symptoms that we think about, such as the sneezing, the watery nose, the runny nose and watery eyes, like also sinus congestion. So there are allergic-like symptoms, the typical allergy symptoms that we hear about and are familiar with, but then it goes beyond that to, again, the racing heart and the dizziness and the just feeling unwell. So DAO deficiency is actually thought to be responsible for about 70% of cases of histamine intolerance. So that means that when we're looking at the reasons behind histamine intolerance, yeah, there's genetic factors, but that's thought to be very small. 70% of the cases are due to just a deficiency in this DAO. And this can be tricky to diagnose, very difficult because the testing for either your DAO levels or your histamine levels do not always reflect what's going on in the body. And that tells you, when you're measuring a blood level, it tells you what your level of, say, histamine or DAO is at that given moment in time. It doesn't always tell you what's happening throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, and also how your body is responding to foods that you're consuming and some of the other factors that can affect your histamine and DAO levels. And I have noticed that a lot of people go a long period of time before they're diagnosed, and often they're misdiagnosed. They're thought that they have other health conditions before the underlying realization that it's a DAO deficiency and histamine intolerance. So that can be challenging. So what are the risk factors for histamine intolerance? Well, as I mentioned, there are DAO deficiency. Genetics is one factor, but people that have inflammatory gut diseases, Crohn's disease, colitis, leaky gut, dysbiosis, and imbalance in the normal microflora, these are all factors that can affect your DAO. DAO is produced in different cells in the body, but one of the primary areas where it's produced in the enterocytes in the gut, the cells in our gut. If there's been a lot of gut damage, if there's a lot of inflammation in the gut, as we see with people that have Crohn's, colitis, leaky gut, dysbiosis, that can dramatically reduce their ability to produce DAO. Also, age is a factor. And what we typically see is people, once they hit 30, 40, maybe 50, they find that they can no longer enjoy their favorite beverage, whether it's beer or wine. And they will say, well, it was never a problem in the past. All of a sudden, now that I've hit 40, everything's changing. I can't tolerate wine. I can't have pizza. I can't have all these foods that I like. As we get older, our ability to produce DAO diminishes. Stress is another factor as well, which can hamper our ability to produce DAO, and it can also compromise gut health. So what are these high histamine foods? Well, the bad news is wine is high on the list. In particular, red wine has much more histamine than white, but there is still histamine in white wine, champagne, and beer. Your fermented foods, so sauerkraut, pickled vegetables like your pickles and other things that you like that are pickled, they have high amounts of histamine. Cheese, aged cheese in particular, we know that the aging process, and when foods are aged and processed and fermented, that increases the levels of histamine. Also cured meats, so pepperoni and salami and luncheon meats and bacon and things like that have high amounts of histamine. And that's a real drag because a lot of people will enjoy these foods together. You might go out for pizza and beer, or you're having wine and cheese, and lo and behold, it's that particular combination that is causing problems in your system. So some of the other high histamine foods, soured foods like sour cream, sourdough bread as well, sour milk. As I mentioned earlier, dried fruits have sulfites in them, but they are also high in histamine. Some of the worst offenders are apricots, prunes, dates, figs, and raisins. You will also find histamine in smoked fish and certain species of fish overall, like mackerel, mahi-mahi, tuna, anchovies, and sardine. So those are some of the most common foods that can be a problem for people that have either a DAO deficiency or they're sensitive to histamine. Now, there are also foods that when you eat them, they trigger the release of histamine. And on this list, we have strawberries and citrus fruit, pineapple, tomatoes, nuts, spinach, and eggs. So these foods can also contribute to the problem because they're triggering the release of histamine. So let's look at some of the medications that can be contributing to this problem. It's been identified that certain medications can inhibit the enzyme diamine oxidase. And on this list, we have some of the antidepressant drugs, such as Cymbalta, Effexor, Zoloft, and Prozac. The non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the NSAIDs like ibuprofen, known as Motrin or Advil, naproxen, which you'll see in the pharmacy as Aleve, and aspirin. Some of the immune modulating drugs as well can inhibit DAO. Anti-arrhythmic medications, people take these drugs to regulate the rhythm of their heart, and blood pressure drugs as well. And I wouldn't suggest that anybody stop taking these, but if you suspect you have a histamine intolerance or a DAO deficiency, you may want to check with your doctor or pharmacist to see if there are alternatives available. So those are the drugs that are well known to contribute to low levels of DAO, but there are also drugs that can deplete DAO levels. And in particular on this list are the antihistamines, which is kind of ironic because people will think, well, if I have all these symptoms of histamine intolerance, maybe I should take an antihistamine. And temporarily, it may help with the congestion, the sneezing, the runny nose, the watery eyes. But over time, these drugs can actually deplete your DAO levels. So the antihistamine drugs like Benadryl, Allegra, Zyrtec, they can worsen the problem, as can the H2 blockers. So the drugs that you'll see in the pharmacy that are used to reduce acid in the stomach, they're targeted or marketed for heartburn and reflux and things like that. Pepcid, Tagamet, Zantac, they can also deplete DAO levels. So back to red wine, one of my favorite beverages until I realized I had a DAO deficiency, histamine intolerance. Red wine is really a triple threat for people that are histamine intolerant because it contains high amounts of histamine, depending on the wine, and again how it's the type of grapes and how it's fermented and other factors. It can have anywhere from 20 to 200% more histamine than white wine. There are also the sulfites that are present in the wine. And then the third factor is that alcohol in any form, so whether red, white, or beer or champagne, alcohol in any form can suppress the activity of that enzyme that our body needs, diamine oxidase. And if we don't have enough of that DAO enzyme, those histamine levels can remain unchecked, and that can lead to those symptoms that we talked about earlier of histamine intolerance. So how can we manage this dilemma? Well, we can look at reducing histamine from our diet by choosing low histamine food options and eating foods that help increase DAO. And there's also a supplement, a dietary supplement that we can get. We can take an enzyme of DAO prior to consuming the histamine-containing foods and beverages. Managing stress levels is always important, whether we're talking about histamine intolerance or basically any other health condition. Keeping our stress levels in check is really important for overall health and wellness. And we want to try and support our gut health. Probiotics are just one factor that's important. There are so many things that we could talk about there, but I am a firm believer in probiotics for improving microflora levels and gut health, and also improving digestion. So what's in your glass? If you like to have a cocktail or two around this time of year, you're better off to choose beverages that, if you suspect again that you're histamine intolerant, choose beverages that are low in histamine. Ciders, there are a lot of ciders that are widely available. White wine is also a good choice. Alcohol like vodka and gin, those beverages are low in both sulfites and histamine. And the other end of the spectrum, we have the red wine, which is again the triple threat because of the sulfites and the histamine and the fact that it's just alcohol in general and affects your DAO. And beer, which is low in sulfites, but fairly low in histamine, but not always able to be tolerated by everybody. So that gives you an idea of the different types of drinks and what their attributes, the benefits and the risks are. So what are some of the low histamine foods? We talked about the foods to avoid, the high histamine foods. Well, here's some of the low histamine foods that are good to include if you suspect you have a histamine intolerance. Grains that are well tolerated, that are low in histamine, include quinoa, which is one of my favorites because it's also high in protein and has a lot of nutrients. Rice is also low in histamine. And when we look at fruits, think about apples, mango, but fresh mango, not dried mango, cantaloupe, watermelon, kiwi, and pears. All vegetables are low in histamine with two exceptions, and that is spinach and eggplant. Enjoy fresh fish, poultry, meat, and some milk alternatives to think about would be your coconut milk, hemp milk, rice, and almond milk. So these are some foods that I would suggest adding to your list because they have a specific purpose in that they can help to increase the release of diamine oxidase. So olive oil, which is a beneficial oil, has a lot of the oleic acid. Great to add to your foods after they're cooked. Not a good oil to fry in or heat to high temperatures, but certainly goes good in recipes, adding it to pasta after it's cooked. Almonds, great snack. High in protein, beneficial fats, chicken, fresh organic chicken, I would say. Green pea sprouts as well. Not a commonly eaten food. People eat peas, but the green pea sprouts in particular can help to increase the release of DAO. Lentils and chickpeas are also on that list too, so you want to include those. So the supplemental strategy for managing histamine intolerance, this is called Umbrellex DAO. And if you have a histamine intolerance and a DAO deficiency, you don't have to avoid your favorite foods altogether. If you moderate your histamine intake and take an enzyme of DAO before you consume histamine-containing foods or beverages, this gives your body what it needs to break down the histamine, and it can dramatically reduce those symptoms of histamine intolerance. What I like about this too is it's something you don't have to take routinely throughout the day. You only take it about 15 to 20 minutes before you're consuming your histamine-containing food and beverages. I know in my experience in counseling patients on food allergies and intolerances, it's virtually impossible to say to somebody, you know, you have to avoid all these histamine containing foods. People may do it for a week or 2 weeks, but not really practical in the long term. So it's great that there is a supplement available that can be taken as a companion to a healthy diet. So the one that I would recommend in particular, this Umbrellex DAO, this is the only food grade form of DAO available anywhere. You will see if you go and do Google searches for histamine intolerance, DAO deficiency, there are other supplements that are out there that are marketed for this. Some of them contain actually no DAO. They contain different vitamins or herbs, and some of them do not contain a therapeutic level of the actual enzymes. So this is what I would look for. This one is a patented food grade form of DAO. It gives your body what it needs to be able to process the histamine. And for people that are asking if they're on other medications, you have other health conditions, there's really a low risk of any problems or interactions because the enzymes work locally in the gut. It's not absorbed into the bloodstream. So it just has an action in the gut. And that's why you take it just before you have your wine, your beer, your pizza, your meat and cheese tray, whatever you're going to be indulging in, you just take it beforehand. The supplement doesn't have any wheat, gluten, yeast, soy, dairy, any of those common allergens or offenders. So you can check that out. There's a website called Umbrellex DAO that you can check out for more information on that. And there's also a self-evaluation and sample trial that you can get if you go to the link that you see on your slide there, Umbrellex DAO, and there's also another one which is just daodeficiency.org. There is a self-evaluation kit that you can do, you can follow along, and it makes it easy to determine if your reaction may be due to a histamine intolerance or a DAO deficiency. As I mentioned, blood testing is not highly reliable, and most researchers and specialists in this area, they will say that, it's almost pointless to do the blood testing for histamine and DAO because it's not actually reflective of what's happening in the body. Doing an elimination diet or avoiding all high histamine foods to see if that improves, that is one strategy, but again, not always practical. You can also do a supplement trial. If you take the supplement before you eat or drink the histamine containing foods or beverages, that can give you a good indication as to whether it's going to be effective. If you feel better, then you know that was most likely the underlying factor, and then you can move on. So you can check out that, follow the link. You can order the self-evaluation kit and you get a sample trial of the enzymes, and you can go from there. So at this point, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your time with me today. I hope you found the information in the webinar useful. I'll take a look at the questions that have come in. And again, as Tom mentioned in the introduction, if we can't get to your question today, you can still send it in and we'll do our best to reply down the road. And just a note as well that I can't answer questions about individual health problems and conditions. But if you do have a general question about DAO or histamine intolerance, feel free to send it my way. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tom.